Disclaimer. This book may contain content that is considered historically inaccurate or culturally insensitive by modern standards. My hope is that by exploring old literature, we will better understand why people of the past thought the way that they did and understand the influences that shape their culture. This video is not intended for young audiences. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read to you from Paul Bunyan by James Stephens. The Bull of the Woods. The straw boss is the backbone of industry was a favorite saying of Paul Bunyan's. The sage observation is constantly repeated today by industrialists who are so overwhelmed by salesmen, efficiency experts, welfare workers, and the like that they are forced to leave production in the hands of the powerful race of foremen. Paul Bunyan had become a true man of the woods, and paperwork troubled him. He was fortunate in discovering the greatest man with figures that ever lived to do his office work for him, and this man, Johnny Inkslinger, did all the figuring alone after he came to camp. But before the renowned timekeeper was found, the keeping of his accounts and records was Paul Bunyan's largest difficulty. He figured warily, and the smell of ink often made him sick. His logging operations grew more extensive as time went on. He brought crews of great little men from overseas and organized his first logging camp. He cleared off 700 townships in the Smiling River country for a big farm, and John Shears, his earnest boss farmer, managed it so efficiently that new companies of loggers had to be added to the camp each season to use up the produce. Consequently, more and more timber was being felled as each season ran its course. At last, it got so that figuring occupied all of Paul Bunyan's time between supper and breakfast, and then he had to take time away from work in the woods for the keeping of his accounts. In vain, he tried to increase his speed as a figurer. He learned to write with both hands at once, but this was no use, for the two sets of figures would mix up in his head and result in confusion. He invented the multiplication table, cube root, and algebra, but production increased so fast that these shortcuts gave him no more time than before for the woods. Then he gave in to necessity and looked about for help. No figurers were anywhere to be discovered, so Paul Bunyan invented bossmen to carry on the work in the woods while he held forth in the office. His first foreman was Gun Gunderson, commonly known as Shot Gunderson because of his explosive nature. He originated the highball system, which is still used in some logging camps. Much of the loggers' tough vocabulary has come down from him. His favorite words of encouragement were, "Put a better notch in that stick, or I'll cave your head in. Heave harder on that peavy handle, you gizzardless scissor bill, or I'll put the cocks to you." He began to lose power when the loggers learned his lingo and came back at him fiercely in his own words. His downfall happened in the second winter on Tadpole River in the Bullfrog Lake country. That was the winter of the big wind, which blew so hard for 4 months that Shot Gunderson had to yell at the top of his voice to be heard in its howling blasts. His voice cracked under the strain, and then, of course, his chief strength as a boss was gone. He became a plain logger again, and Crossholson succeeded him. This industrious man was a worthy and well-beloved boss, but he, too, had a fatal weakness. Such a passion for river driving did he possess that he could never stop the drive at its destination, but he would run the logs on for miles and then drive them back again. This upstream driving was terrible labor, for each logger had to drive one log at a time. Treading it, he would roll it against the current. So much time and energy was wasted for Chris Crossholson's pleasure that Paul Bunyan was forced to depose him. The next chief was Ole Olson. He was so loved that countless loggers have been named after him, but his tender heart made him a failure as a boss. Other bosses were Lars Larson, Swan Swanson, Pete Peterson, John Johnson, Jens Jensen, Anders Anderson, Hans Hansen, and Eric Eriksson. They were all noblemen, and loggers and millmen are still named in their honor, but not one was powerful enough to keep his job as Paul Bunyan's aide. Once, indeed, it was thought that an ideal foreman had been discovered when a burly man who called himself Murph Murphson was put on the job. But one night he was heard talking Gaelic in his sleep. Cross-questioned, he admitted that his true name was Pat Murphy. Knowing Paul Bunyan's predilection for Scandinavian foremen, he had called himself Murph Murphson in order to get his high position. Deceit was the one human frailty that the great logger had no tolerance for, and the Irish boss followed his predecessors. Paul Bunyan was now without a foreman, and he had never had a greater need for a good one, for his next project was to log off the Dakota country, which was then known as the region of the mountain that stood on its head. Difficulties loomed before him, which only he or a better foreman than he had yet discovered could surmount, and thus he discovered either a great figurer or a great foreman's success would be improbable. Then fortune shone on him with sudden, dazzling brightness, for word came down through the woods that the mightiest logger of Sweden was tramping overland for Paul Bunyan's camp. The gossip that ran before him called him Sweden's greatest milker also, and some whispered that he was the greatest fisherman and the greatest hunter of that country of superb giants. It was rumored that he was taller than a tree, as tall as Paul Bunyan and as wide, and that he feared no man. The great logger, toiling over his vast ledgers, heard and hoped that the perfect foreman was coming to him at last. He arrived at the end of a bright June day. The loggers were at supper, happily occupied with pea soup and hardtack, which were their only rations at that time. The soup bowls before the loggers were emptying fast, and the cookhouse resounded with a hissing rumble, to which the clangor of the spoons striking the bottoms of the bowls was presently added. Then above the noise was heard a slow, muffled boom, boom, boom. The loggers listened and wondered. "Old Paul's walking heavy this evening," said some. Said others, "But it don't sound like old Paul's step anyway." And the booming tramp sounded nearer. The cookhouse began to shake. The loggers, curious and wondering, gulped down the last of their soup and hurried outside. Through the trees that covered the slopes above the camp they saw a great man approaching. He was not as tall as the tallest trees, but the shortest ones were no higher than his waist. Yellow bristles protruded through the crevices in the hat that was cocked on one side of his head. He walked with a swagger that sent the limbs crashing as he swayed against them. A good-sized pine tree stood in his way, and he cast it aside and marched on. When he had reached the center of the camp, he stopped and said in a commanding voice, "I want see Paul Bunyan." While he waited, the loggers gazed in awe on his heroic figure, and they whispered to one another that here at last was the Swede of wonderful deeds. It was indeed a marvelous moment for them. Every real logger today would give 10 years of his life to have been among the men who first saw Hells Helson the mighty, the big Swede, the incomparable bull of the woods. When Paul Paulson came forth, he made no attempt to conceal his pleasure over the newcomer. For the first time in months, the darkness of worry lifted from his countenance, and a smile shone through his beard. He shook hands awkwardly, as this was a novel experience for him. Here was a man whom he did not have to look down upon to see, one man who could reach above the great logger's boot-tops. Surely he would make an ideal foreman. Though a fierce light glittered at moments in his blue eyes, his grin showed that he possessed the amiability that a good foreman must have. Being a Swede, he was certainly trustworthy and obedient. In broken, real American, Hells Helson began to tell Paul Bunyan of the purpose of his journey from the old country, but he got no further than an account of his hard tramp over the polar lands, where he had lived on white bear meat and whale steak, when Paul Bunyan stopped him. "A mountain of energy, a river of power like yourself, does not need to make explanations or ask me for anything," said the mighty logger. "I appoint you foreman at once without hesitation." "Foreman?" asked Hells Helson, seemingly puzzled. "Yes," said Paul Bunyan heartily. "You shall be boss over all my loggers in the timber and on the drives. Honor and glory will be yours, for you shall be remembered as long as men fell trees. I will give you a fitting title. I call you the Bull of the Woods, a name which shall be applied to only the greatest of woods bosses hereafter, because you were the first to have it." "No," began Helsen, but his words were drowned in the great cheer which had arisen from the excited loggers. Their enthusiasm inspired Paul Bunyan to make one of his famous speeches. He spoke for an hour about the historic accomplishment that was now certain in the logging off of the mountain that stood on its head. "A cheer now, my men, for Helsen, the bull of the woods." Thus Paul Bunyan ended his speech, and the loggers responded with a shout that sounded like one throat had made it. Several times during the early part of the speech, Helsen had attempted to interrupt Paul Bunyan, but he was always silenced by the matchless eloquence of the master orator. And when the loggers cheered him, he kept in his heart whatever he wanted to say. He frowned and mumbled powerfully for a moment, but then he grinned and obediently followed Paul Bunyan into the camp office. The Virgin Dakota country of that time had what was no doubt the most beautiful and unique scenic feature in real America. In the center of a forested plain stood the largest and most original of all mountains, the mountain that stood on its head. Its peak was buried in the ground, and its slopes ran outward instead of in toward its summit. It was 5 miles in a direct line from the head of the mountain, and up the slope to the rim of its foot. Ascent would seem impossible to any beholder, for a climber up the mountainside would necessarily have to move his feet uppermost, or else walk with his head. The stubborn pine trees on the mountainsides had refused to grow unnaturally. They had kept their roots in the ground, and their tops all pointed downward. The summit of the mountain, perhaps I should go on saying foot, but this might prove confusing, was a plain 2 miles above a plain, for it was flat and heavily timbered with the noblest of close-grained pine. This unnatural but wonderful mountaintop was in the form of a true circle, which was 127 miles in circumference. At one place the rim of the circle rose gently, and a mild slope ran away from it towards the center of the plain. Here were the high springs, whose waters formed a lofty river and flowed smoothly through aisles of pine, and wound among meadows which were abloom with mountain orchids and fragrant with purple clover. The falls in which the river made its 2-mile drop to the plain below had been named Niagara by Paul Bunyan to honor the memory of his old moose hound, and the name was later passed on to a little waterfall along the border. It was to this place of scenic grandeur that Paul Bunyan now moved his camp. It was here that he was determined to try out Helsen and make him prove his right to the title of Bull of the Woods. The camp was put in order. The axemen and sawyers were given their stations in the woods. Trails were swamped out for Babe, the big blue ox, to use in snaking the logs to the landings. Helsen was given final instructions. Paul Bunyan then retired with a sigh to his ledgers, and the logging began. Paul Bunyan had figured that it would require 2 seasons to log off Dakota, 1 season for the lowlands and 1 for the mountain. But he did not know Helsen, the big Swede. From the time that he yelled, "Roll out or roll up," on his first morning in camp, the loggers felt the urge of a new power, and they put a vigor and force into their work which had been lacking for a long time. Not often did the Bull of the Woods speak to them, but when he did, his roar made the loggers remember his title, and the chips flew from the axe bits like leaves in a wind, and the saws smoked as they flashed back and forth in the tree trunks. Logs piled up ahead of the blue ox, but Helsen, remembering the tricks he had learned as a great man with cattle in the old country, took the exuberant, well-meaning creature in hand and taught him speed. So active did Babe become that only Helsen could handle him. Each morning, eager to get to work, he galloped madly for the woods, while the foreman held grimly to the halter rope, thrown from his feet very often, hurled through the air, bounced over rocks and stumps, but holding fast always. So rapidly did the logging go on that Paul Bunyan could only accomplish the necessary figuring by giving all of his time to it. He began to weary of his hours at the desk, while his soul cried out for the timber. He envied Helsen for the ideal life he was living, but he gladly gave him the honor and glory that was his due. Latin Paul Bunyan praised his great Nordic foreman constantly and said nothing of himself. Now, as Paul Bunyan's only physical weakness was a ticklishness of the neck, so was his only mental weakness extreme modesty. He never boasted, and he never belittled the pretensions of his men by reminding them of his own part in their achievements. Consequently, his inventions were taken as a matter of course, and his paperwork was not considered very difficult by his loggers because they knew nothing about it. His praise of Hell's Helson and his reticence about himself naturally made his men exaggerate the greatness of the Bull of the Woods and minimize the importance of Paul Bunyan. The theft on Hell's Helson was even more dangerous. In the first place, he had not come to Paul Bunyan with the intention of seeking a foreman's job. He had wanted to propose a partnership between the greatest man of Sweden and the greatest man of real America. But Paul Bunyan's oratory had baffled him, and he had taken the position without arguing for what he considered his rightful place. However, a resentment had been kindled in his soul, and with his success as a foreman, it flamed into an exalted opinion of his own powers. As the time for logging off the mountain approached, he resolved to not only make this enterprise bring him equality with Paul Bunyan, but a position of command over him. Therefore, a terrible conflict was inevitable. The first intimation that Paul Bunyan had of the coming struggle was during the preparations for logging off the mountain. He himself had made many plans for accomplishing the difficult job, taking time from his office work to think them out. Then the first drive was finished, and the day came when the felling was to begin on the mountainside. On that morning, Paul Bunyan was about to call his foreman to give him instructions when he heard the loggers marching out of camp. Hell's Helson was taking them to the woods. The foreman had seemed to think it unnecessary to consult with Paul Bunyan. For a moment, the master of the camp had a raging impulse to take after them and assert his authority, but his good sense restrained him. There is no appetite more powerful than that for the strong meat of authority, Paul Bunyan always told his boss men, but if you bite off more than you can chew, nothing will choke you more surely. Paul Bunyan remembered this saying now, and he thought it best to let Hell's Helson learn the lesson for himself. So for days he made no inquiries about the progress of the work in the woods. He busied himself with his figures and waited. He noted with secret pleasure the bafflement and worry that showed in deeper lines on Hell's Helson's face each succeeding night. The loggers were always utterly weary now when they got into camp. At last, many of them were too exhausted to eat their pea soup when the day was done. Others went to sleep at the supper table, and they would not awaken until breakfast time. Then the first week's scale was brought in, and it showed only an average of 1 tree per man for each 72 hours of labor. The master logger chuckled over this, but he said nothing. On Monday morning, his accounts being in order, he walked over the bump to where he could observe the logging operations. On the slopes, or under them rather, of the mountain that stood on its head crawled Hell's Helson, and he was urging the loggers to follow him. Not an original method had he devised. He was even insisting that the loggers walk upside down and fell the trees in exactly the same style that they used when standing up. Having been a champion mountain climber in Sweden, he got up the slopes without much difficulty, and he strung cables between the trees. Along these cables the loggers busily worked themselves. Tree felling, even under ordinary conditions, is hard labor for the strongest men. But when a woodsman attempts to operate a limber crosscut saw and a heavy axe, his head down, his body hanging by a leather belt which is fastened to a swaying cable, when a woodsman looks up to see his feet and have dirt and sawdust fall down in his eyes, when a woodsman looks down to see rocks and stumps 1.5 miles below him, brave and powerful though he may be, a woodsman in such circumstances is bound to feel inconvenienced, harassed, and impeded in the performance of his labor. And even the threatening roars and the bleating bellows of a Hell's Helson, the supreme and original bull of the woods, cannot make him work efficiently. The test of great leadership is originality, mused Paul Bunyan as he returned to camp. At least some inventiveness is needed. Heroic Hell's Helson, the bull of the woods, a fair title. The hero inspires, but the thinker leads. I shall now think. One great idea put into action can set the world afire. Surely it will take no more than a common one to master Hell's Helson. In such solemn ponderings, Paul Bunyan spent the rest of the day. Until midnight, he thought, and then the idea came. He had once went to work to make a reality of it. From an old chest that held the weapons and traps of his pre-logging days, he brought forth the most prized weapon of his youth, a gold-butted, diamond-mounted, double-barreled shotgun. He spent the rest of the night in careful cleaning of all its parts. An idea of the size and power of the super cannon can be gained when it is remembered that he used its 2 barrels at a later time as smokestacks for his first sawmill. The shells for it were made from the largest cedar logs in the country. They were hollowed out, bound with brass, and capped with sheet iron. After breakfast, when the loggers had gone wearily to their terrible labor, Paul Bunyan ordered Big Ol, the blacksmith, to cut up thousands of pieces of sheet iron, making each one 2 feet square. In 2 days he had the shells loaded, and he was ready to try out his idea. Then he waited for the time when Hals Helsen would have to call on him for help. And this time was sure to come soon, for as the work slowly moved up from the head of the mountain, the unimaginative logging methods of the stubborn bull of the woods could not but fail completely, and Hals Helsen was not the leader to change these methods himself. He was only a hero. But Paul Bunyan was not prepared for the monstrous display of effrontery which was given by Hals Helsen when the exhausted loggers could no longer follow him up the mountainside. One morning, the foreman did not call the men out to work. Instead, Paul Bunyan heard him giving them orders to pack up. "Thunderation!" exclaimed the master logger. "What means this, Hals?" The bull of the woods was attaching a cable to the cookhouse skids. He looked up with an insolent grin. "I forgot to tell you, Bunyan, but I go and moved our camp," he said in tones of marked disrespect. "No use to try hard no more. No, I think logger can stand on head much longer har. I don't think so, Bunyan. We move New Yogno." "Bunyan!" exploded the appalled leader. "Bunyan, you call me. You think you'll move the camp. You will do so by the blazing sands of the high hills of hell, and by the stinking steam of its low swamp water. How in the name of the holy old Mackinaw, how in the names of the whistling old, roaring old, jumping old, bald-headed, blue-bellied Jim Chris, and the do you figure you're wearing any shining crown of supreme authority in this man's camp? Say!" "I think so," said Hals Helsen calmly. "Suffering old saints and blary-eyed fathers. Yeah, I think so." With a mighty effort, Paul Bunyan recovered his poise and dignity. He strode to the office and got his shotgun and a sack of shells loaded with sheet iron squares. Then his all-out man rolled through the camp. The power of that unloosed voice threw each logger into the air, and they all dropped, bottoms down, on the rocky ground. They were still dazed men as they wobbled to their feet, and they meekly followed their rightful leader toward the mountain, rubbing sore spots with their hands as they staggered along. Muttering darkly, Hals Helsen followed at a distance. Paul Bunyan halted the loggers before they reached the shadows of the mountain. He turned and faced them, and for a moment they stood in breathless terror, fearing that he was going to urge them to another effort on the slopes above. But no, Paul Bunyan only said, in the tones of a gentle teacher, "You see before you a logged-off plain. Only stumps remain upon its soil. I shall make you a forest. Behold!" He turned and lifted the shotgun to his shoulder and pulled the triggers. Both barrels went off in such a violent explosion that many of the loggers again tumbled to the ground. Clouds of dust dropped from the mountainside and blanketed the plain. When the wind had thinned out the fog, the amazed loggers saw the beginnings of a new forest before them. The loads from the 2 shells had sheared off 1,000 trees. They had dropped straightly down and plunged their tops into the plain, and there they stood, the strangest grove ever seen by a man. The small, brushy tops of the trees were embedded in the ground, and their huge bare trunks were swaying high in the air. Before the loggers had recovered from their astonishment at the sight, Paul Bunyan was firing again, and all that day the terrific explosions of his gun and the falling clouds of dust from the mountain addled the loggers. At sundown, he had completed the circuit around the mountain that stood on its head. Its slopes were shorn of trees, and the plain underneath once more had a forest. It was an amazing artificial one, and the loggers doubted if they could get used to it. But it promised easy logging, and when their leader ordered them into camp, they went singing. It looked like the good old times were back. "Now," said Paul Bunyan to his foreman, "the idea has mastered the material. I turn the job over to you. Go to it in the morning. In the meantime, I'll invent a way to log off the foot of the mountain, which towers yonder among the clouds." Halston said nothing, but he scowled and scratched his head. In the morning, Paul Bunyan was figuring briskly, quite content again, when he noticed a stir in the camp that was unusual for the late hour. He looked out and saw the loggers wandering idly about. They said that Halston had not ordered them to roll out, but had gone to the woods himself. Sensing that a struggle was at hand for the dominance of the camp, and realizing that the powerful and obtuse Halston could only be conquered by physical force, Paul Bunyan ordered his men to remain behind, and he started after the foreman. Halston was climbing the mountain when Paul Bunyan reached the new forest, and he paid no heed to the calls that were sent after him. The climber had his shoes off, and he moved up swiftly by grasping the largest stumps of the sheer trees with his fingers, wrapping his toes around others, and drawing himself up like a rope climber. In a short time he reached the rim, and, throwing his leg over it, he drew himself to the top. He rested for a moment, then he stood up and began uprooting the close-grained white pine trees, which extended scores of miles before him. A tumult of rage swelled up in Paul Bunyan's heart. So Halston had rebelled and become an independent logger. If competition had been necessary to the logging industry, the greatest logger himself would have invented it. But he knew that equality was an evil thing. A powerful rival was not to be tolerated. For the sake of the grand new race of loggers, if for nothing else, Halston must be put in his proper place. Wise, even in wrath, Paul Bunyan did not attempt to climb the mountain. He ran to a far point of the plain. Then he turned and rushed back with his greatest speed. When he neared the mountain, he leaped. He struck the ground with his knees, bending for a spring, and then he threw himself upward in a tremendous lunge. His upstretched hands brushed down the slope and started a roaring avalanche. A large section of the rim gave way, and now a large hill stood under the broken edge of the mountain rim. Again, Paul Bunyan ran and leaped. This time he made his second jump from the hilltop, and his hands caught over a cliff that jutted below the broken rim. Laboriously he drew himself up. He thrust his foot over the top, and after a struggle that sent more rocks and trees crashing down upon the hill, he won to the plain and lay resting for the battle. A minute had not passed before he felt the mountain shake, and when he rolled over, he saw Halston rushing upon him. The big Swede's blue eyes flashed like hot polished steel. The gritting of his teeth sounded like the grind of a rock crusher. His hat was off, and his yellow bristles stuck up like tall, ripe grain on a squat hill. The pine trees rocked and creaked from the wind of his swinging fists. The mighty Paul Bunyan sprang to his feet and received the furious charge as a cliff of solid rock receives the smash of a tidal wave. The loggers in camp heard a stupendous uproar of battle, and they fled from the shaking bunkhouses. The bravest among them crawled to the top of the hump, from where they could see the mountain. When they beheld the titanic conflict that was raging 2 miles above them on the flat mountaintop, they stood like images of stone and stared affrightedly. Around and around the 127-mile circle of the lofty plain, the leader and the foreman fought with all their powers. Now came a sound like a thunderclap as Paul Bunyan smote Halston solidly on his square jaw. Now came a sound like a hurricane screeching through a network of cables as Halston's hand seized Paul Bunyan's beard and was jerked loose. For a long time the struggle seemed equal, with neither combatant suffering great injury. Then Paul Bunyan's shoulders struck acres of pine trees with the crash of a tornado. A heaving mass of dust rolled over him, but the dauntless leader's head was suddenly thrust above it. The logger saw his fist fly from behind him. It squashed over Halston's nose, and the sun shone red through a spray of blood. Balloons and geysers of dust now rose explosively all over the mountaintop, and heavy gray clouds soon hid the mountain from view. Trees and rocks crashed everywhere on the plain below. The convulsions of the earth increased in force. Even the bravest of the loggers were at last terrified by the shocks and blasts, and they fled to camp and hid under their blankets. All night the tumult of battle sounded, but at dawn there was a crash of such shocking force that it upset every bunkhouse, and then a sudden hush. The loggers, all shell-shocked and bruised, crawled under their overturned bunks, but as the quiet persisted, they at length ventured outside. The dust was still rolling by in thick clouds, and they could not see their hands before them. But at sunup it had thinned out, and ere long they beheld the figure of one of the fighters looming in the distance. The conqueror was carrying his helpless adversary over his shoulder, and this conqueror, this victor in that tourney of the Titans, that battle of behemoths, that ride of the races, that Herculean jaw-hammering, chin-mauling, nose-pounding, side-stamping, cheek-tearing, rib-breaking, lip-pinching, back-beating, neck-choking, eye-gouging, tooth-jerking, arm-twisting, head-butting, beard-pulling, ear-biting, bottom-thumping, toe-holding, knee-tickling, shin-cracking, heel-bruising, belly-whacking, hair-yanking, hell-roaring, supreme, and incomparable knockdown and drag-out fight of all history was the mighty leader of the new race of loggers, battling Paul Bunyan. Tattered, bloody, dirt-streaked, he marched with dignity still. On through the hosts of silent, awed loggers he passed, without glancing down at them. He disappeared with the bull of the woods into the camp office. "You're going to be a good foreman now, Halshelson." "Think so?" "I think so, Mr. Bunyan." "You know so, Halshelson." "Ah, Mr. Bunyan." And no more was said. The wonderful mountain was gone. Alas, the struggle had demolished it and scattered its majesty in dust over the plain. Today the northern winds blow down over the desolate remains of that once noble and marvelous eminence, the remains of blood-darkened dust which are now known as the Black Hills of Dakota. And that is the end of The Bull of the Woods by James Stephens. Thank you for listening to this story from Paul Bunyan with me, and I hope that you have a great day. Bye!